Welcome to Scrappy, the podcast about small companies doing big things. I'm your host, Chris Stragus. We've been working hard to collect stories and interviews for our second season. But in light of all the recent changes we've been going through, from politics to pandemics to protests, we've decided to change things up a bit. Instead of waiting to launch a whole new season that would run over just 10 short weeks, we are instead going to let loose a new episode continuously each month or so, and in that way get more great stories out more often. And I couldn't think of a better place to start this season than a big anniversary that our country has coming up this weekend. One you may not even be aware of. 30 years ago, on July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. This groundbreaking legislation was the world's first comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities. It would usher in a new era of rights, freedoms, and care for one of our nation's greatest untapped citizen resources. And it would bring into the fold an entire segment of our society that had, for too long, been marginalized, stigmatized, and second-classed. But 1990 was not the end of this work. Really, it was just the beginning. And today, the work continues with more momentum than ever before, and with a new era of advocates on the front lines. Advocates like Debra Ruh.
My name is Debra Ruh, and I'm the CEO and founder of Ruh Global Impact.
Debra is kind of an unexpected hero in this fight. In the mid-1980s, she was nurturing a successful career in the banking industry and looking forward to starting a family. But in 1987, her path took an unexpected turn after the birth of her daughter, Sara. Before too long, she found herself forging her own way, employing an internal drive to help those in need, a drive that had long been waiting just below the surface. Debra, thank you for joining me today. There is so much that I look forward to learning about the work and advocacy that you've been doing for 2 decades now. But if we could, I want to start just a bit earlier. A young Debra Ruh was just coming of age in the turmoil of the late 60s and early 70s. How would the Debra of today describe that time and that little girl growing up in the Deep South?
Oh, that's a great question, Chris. And thank you so much for having me on your show. I really like your podcast. I am a baby boomer, and I'm the later part of the baby boomers. And so the Vietnam War was going on, all the protests were going on, and the hippie movements and burning the bras, and a lot of that was happening when I was in elementary school in the beginning of getting into the middle school. Even then, there was a lot of fighting about truly including African Americans in our society, and why were we segregating everyone? And so there was a lot of turmoil, and there was a lot of turmoil, unfortunately, in my family, because my mother really, really struggled with mental health issues, and she was diagnosed as borderline personality disorder, which is it's a really, really tough one. And she did the very best she could, and I understand that as an adult, but as a child, you never knew what was going to happen from moment to moment, day to day. It was very turbulent inside the house. And so the outside world was just some other place that I didn't completely understand, but it seemed like there was a lot of turmoil happening out there as well.
In the midst of all that, though, by the mid-70s, you were at the precipice of adulthood, and you were ready to sort of shape your future. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I really wanted to be a journalist, even though I wasn't a great writer, but I wanted to be a journalist. And then I thought, I think I'm going to be a police officer, because police officers, help people and save the world. But I remember my father saying to me, no, you can't be a police officer, Debra. You won't be able to handle it. Your heart is too tender. It'll crush you. And so then I remember moving more to okay, I want to be a psychiatrist. So I always knew I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to make a difference. But at the same time, I was never encouraged to go to school, go to college. My family didn't have a lot of money. So it was never, ever anything we talked about. We weren't really encouraged to think about what's your career and where you're going to go. Both of my parents retired. They worked their whole life and retired from AT&T. And when I graduated from high school, I graduated in 77. And my mom got me a job at AT&T. I was an overseas operator. So I was in that, you see them in the shows, the big switchboards and people are plugging in the wires and stuff. I made really good money. That time, I was making $35,000 a year plus expenses, which was great money. And I hated every single second of it. So after I did it for a year, I thought, I'm not doing this. And I quit and I became a waitress and I started working my way through college. But everybody was shocked, especially my mom. And she was so mad at me when I quit this really good job. But I just didn't want to spend my whole life doing that. And so I guess I was a little bit of a renegade.
You were in the mid-'80s. You're in your mid to late 20s. You're making good money before you quit. Where did you meet your husband and when did you get married?
I met him in the restaurant business. So when I quit AT&T, I went and started working at a restaurant. It's not around anymore, but some people might remember it was called Victoria Station. Mm-hmm. And they had the best prime rib. It was the best prime rib, and it was modeled after the Victoria Station cars. And so they actually would have a train, part of a train as part of the restaurant. I remember the first time I met my husband when he had just moved there from Atlanta. I loved that he had such a gentleness about him and he felt very, very safe to me. And so that was very, very attractive. Somebody that seems so stable and calm and gentle. And he is still that same way. We've been married 38 years in September. Unfortunately, my husband now has early onset dementia because when he was a child, when he was 11 years old, he was just getting a kite going. And if anybody that's ever gotten a kite, you finally get it going and the air's lifted and it's lifting out, it's flying, and he was running with it and he ran in front of a car and the car hit him. He was 11. It threw him 750 feet. He actually died on the scene. They brought him back. They took him to the hospital. He was in a coma for a couple of weeks, and then he didn't go back to school for months. And when he did go back to school, things were different for him. He used to be a straight A student, and he was then, a medium student. And so unfortunately, even though we have these amazing brains that rewire and figure out how to work around an injury, his brain was still very, very seriously injured. And so as he aged, the brain has aged into dementia. And that's been a very interesting, path at the same time. But he still grew up, got married, had 2 children, worked, in telecommunications. And so there was a success story, but it's just now it's so hard for him. It's very hard for him. And it's been hard for all of us. But there's also beauty in it. There's a very interesting beauty in this trip too, this journey, because my husband that was always there and gentle and kind and happy, not quite as high strung as his wife, he's still there.
Yeah.
But he's lost a lot of processing abilities, but the soul, the person that I fell in love with is still there. He still knows me. He still thinks I'm great. He's still, he's so patient with me. But so it's interesting walking this because the person that makes him so important to me is still there.
Yeah. So again, I'm trusting my math here, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong. On a beautiful Easter day, I believe in 1987. Yes. You gave birth to a daughter, Sara.
Yes.
As happens to anyone on their first child, and I can speak from experience, there's a seismic shift.
Yeah.
There's a beauty and optimism for life and future, mixed though with an absolute fear of not knowing what actually being a parent really means.
Right.
I'm sure that, like anyone else, you get that vision in your mind of a healthy, happy child growing up to be a productive, successful adult. It can
Right.
be a really magical time, but in just a few short months, before you even settled down from that first seismic event, an even bigger one was about to hit, one that literally changed the course of your life. So,
Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit about the moment when everything changed for you?
Yes, and thank you for asking. I wanted to have kids so bad. I was just one of those little girls that always wanted to have kids. And so when my husband and I got married when I was 23, we started trying. And we and nothing happened, but we would try, then we would, we tried, and we wouldn't. And then when I was 28, I became pregnant, and I remember being just so excited that I was pregnant. And then, as you said, Chris, and then I thought, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I don't think we're qualified yet. So, but at that point, welcome. So, when my daughter was actually born, I had this weird little thought float through my mind. And when this thought floated through my mind, and I'll say the thought was, wow, she looks like a little baby with Down syndrome. And immediately I thought, what? I don't even know what a baby with Down syndrome looks like. So I dismissed it. 4 months later, the doctors were finding that she was having what they called failure to thrive. My beautiful, perfect little 4-month-old baby. And one doctor started suspecting there was more, and they did the test and realized that she had Down syndrome. And they called my husband and I. And this is a call that you know is not going to go well. I remember I was at work, and I was working in telecommunications at a bank, and I get a call from the doctor's office, and they said, the doctor wants to see you and your husband today at 2. And so my husband and I went in, and they told us that Sara had Down syndrome, and they used the word Mongolism, which is no longer appropriate. They made comments about, you could put her in an institution, and that's not going to happen. And I just, and the first thing I blurted out was, well, I'm not telling my mother. And the doctor said, Debra, you cannot hide that your daughter has Down syndrome. Oh yeah, you want to see? So yes, I can. But it really did just change our world. And I didn't think I knew anybody with a disability, which of course I learned that's ridiculous. But I also had the gift that I already knew this little girl. She'd been, born 4 months before, and she was so sweet, and she was so loving, and she was she was a great little baby. She still is a great woman, but at the same time, I did have to walk the steps. Denial, I'm not going to tell anybody. I remember I drove one day through fast food. I remember it was the Hardee's. And the real sweet little teenager that was behind the window, as I drove up to get my drink and food, she leaned out of the window and she said, oh, your baby's so cute. Does she have Down syndrome? Oh, she's so beautiful. My brother has Down syndrome. And I felt like that teenager had stabbed me in the heart. I didn't want people to know my daughter had Down syndrome. I didn't want them to. I was still in that part of the journey. So it was, life gives you lots of opportunities to grow.
With the lessons you were learning through the early years of Sara's life, let's say by the 90s, she's growing up and beginning to come of age, just like that young Debra back in the 1970s Gainesville. But the times obviously are very different at this point, and so are young Sara's circumstances, obviously. What kind of unexpected challenges did you face, not just at home, but in society at large?
The first thing I really hated right at the beginning, from the moment we found out on, was how much people underestimated Sara, and how much people would learn that I had a daughter with Down syndrome, and they would say, "Oh, we're so sorry. It was such a tragedy." And I thought, well, why is this such a tragedy? She's a really cool kid, and she's funny, and she's creative, and was a real smart aleck, and there was so many interesting things about her, and I didn't understand why society couldn't see. There wasn't any information on how to raise her, what to expect. We were putting her in early education, and trying to give her advantages, but you were on your own unless you wanted to read the dark, dark, dark literature that was out at the time about people with Mongolism and all it was just that they die really young. And the data that was out was all based on when we took babies and we put them in institutions. I didn't have any support to go. People just didn't understand the journey. And I hope that's better for parents now. I know that I've tried to be one of the leaders out there with information, but it was you were alone. You just felt very alone.
Well, you had mentioned Sara's personality, and I have to expect that she gets a lot of her personality traits, and specifically her optimism and resilience from you as well. I saw a story about how she made some friends on a bus ride to school.
I know, that's a great story. I live in rural Virginia, and my kids had a really long bus drive to school. But I worked full time at the bank, and my husband worked at Capital One, and so we didn't have the luxury of being able to drive them to school or anything. So a couple of houses down, there were a couple of girls that lived there. And so they would get on the bus, and Sara said to them one day, "Hey, hi, can I be your friend?" And the little girl said, "No, we don't want to be your friend." And Sara's like, "Why?" And her brother was on the bus, and he was so mad. And some of the other kids were really mad too that these little girls did this. But they said, "No, we don't want to be your friend." So my daughter thought about it and everything. And so the next day, the bus, the little girls get on, and Sara's like, "Hey, can I be friends?" And they're like, "No." So Sara did this to these little girls every single day for weeks. Finally, the girls are like, fine, we'll be your friend. Because there was also not only Sara continuing to ask, but the peer pressure of all the other kids, because the kids really treated Sara like they understood that you shouldn't be mean to her. Now, they were horrible to each other. My son, he got bullied, and I'm sure they all dished it out themselves. But the kids, they didn't really bully Sara. I mean, these little girls were like, "I'm not going to be your friend," but she just wore them down. "Fine, we'll be your friend."
Let's fast forward to 2000, the year 2000. The year opens with the world bracing for a technology meltdown with Y2K. The year ends with the world learning the term hanging Chad. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But in your own life is about to irrevocably change course. How did you go from average citizen to advocate?
When they first told us that Sara had Down syndrome, I thought, how can I contribute? And I couldn't really figure it out for a long time. And I was in the banking industry, and there was a project in our bank. They'd asked the managers, I was vice president, they asked the managers if you would hire some people with disabilities. And so I did do that. And so that was some ways I could contribute. And when we would do United Way or Easter Seals, or I could talk about how those organizations supported our family when we were walking this. But I wanted to do more. So when Sara, she reached that middle school part. So she was in middle school, and we had a conversation with her teachers and the different special ed experts, and it was a meeting to talk about Sara's future. And so I was in this meeting with all these experts, and I'm just the mom, and they are talking about pretty much Sara won't be able to contribute anything to society in the future. She will not be welcome in the workforce, and it's, pretty much she'll be dependent on all of us for the rest of her life. And I thought, what? Have you even talked to my daughter? Can we have a conversation about what she wants to do? And she's so smart in her own way. And why do you think there's no room for her in society? And one of the people said, well, I guess what she could do is just bring shopping carts in from, a Target or a Walmart. And I thought, really? That's the stretch goal you have for my daughter? So at that moment, I woke up to really the plight that many people with disabilities walk. And I thought, I don't think society should work that way. So I decided I was going to create my own company. I'd never been somebody with a burning entrepreneurial desire to start a company. I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I really liked working for big corporations. So my identity was really wrapped up in working for big corporate America. But I thought, okay, I'm going to start my own business and I'm going to employ people with disabilities. So I created a company in 2001 called Tech Access. I love technology. My father was a technologist with AT&T, and I just love technology. So I thought, okay, I'll be a technologist, and I'll employ people with disabilities that are technologists. And there was this law that had just been refreshed on the books, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And in 2001, we updated it and put a little bit more teeth in the Section 508 part of the law, saying that the United States government could not build, procure, buy any technology unless it was fully accessible to all citizens, including citizens with disabilities. So we were working with websites, but also software and hardware too, to make sure it was fully accessible to people with disabilities. And the majority of the team were people with disabilities. So I had a huge advantage over my competitors because I was employing the people that they were trying to make technology accessible for. I had all these super talented employees with disabilities. Like there was a gentleman that worked for me that lived in the Virginia home in Richmond, Virginia. So he was a quadriplegic and he needed around-the-clock care. I had a woman who actually still works for me at the new company, Rosemary, that was born with cerebral palsy. And Rosemary told me once that when she lies down flat, she can only blink her eyes. That's the control she has of her body, but she's brilliant and she's a creative and imaginative. She's just a really amazing woman. And so I learned so much by these individuals. I also learned that I remember one gentleman that worked for me. He had very, very severe diabetes and he sustained multiple traumatic brain injuries. And he said to me one time, Debra, I know I'm not going to live as long as my peers just because of these disabilities, but I want to make a difference while I'm here. And so I started realizing this is not just about you making a difference, Debra. This is about you making sure that he and others have the limelight so their voices can be heard. But the corporations weren't, and I still often feel are not, still seriously taking true disability inclusion and accessibility to heart. It's still a compliance issue for them to check off. My company, Tech Access, failed because of a bank we were with in Virginia. It was one of the first small business banks to fail because of the greed of the big banks. That's when I took my company and I merged it in with another company that also was in the field, and all of my employees got hired and got pay increases. And so I lost a lot of money. Some investors lost a lot of money, but I saved my employees with disabilities, which was very important to me at the time. So I stayed with that company for about 18 months, and it wasn't really my cup of tea. And so I went and created Ruh Global Impact because I just didn't think anybody was telling the stories about, yes, we need to be accessible, and yes, we need to include people with disabilities, but why? What are the stories, and why is it important to these corporations to do this, and these organizations? It's not just for corporations. I mean, why should anyone care about these topics, accessibility and inclusion? I just felt that the stories needed to be told, and I didn't see anyone doing that.
What does accessibility mean to you?
Oh, good question. Accessibility means that technology works for all of us. And I think also accessibility is bigger than technology. It's certainly ICT, internet communications and technology, because it's got to be all the devices have to work. I have to have, good internet connection. So the digital inclusion is part of it. Your software, your apps, as you know, technology and communications has just changed and changed and changed and changed so much. But at the same time, also, the built environment has to be accessible, because if I can't go into a restaurant because I'm with a friend that's in a wheelchair, I'm not going to go to that restaurant. So everything has to be accessible. And the good news about accessibility is when you make things accessible, it makes it accessible for everybody else. So when we started captioning videos and transcribing audio, the good news is that 80 to 85% of people watch videos with the sound turned off. So if you're captioning it, you're going to, whether you do open caption or closed caption, you allow me to turn it on and off. Maybe I don't want to see the text. You're going to make that experience more beneficial to everybody else. And another thing that I learned about accessibility is, and I talk about this all the time, as we live our lives, my husband's a perfect example of that, we change. We change. And according to AARP, 46% of us over the age of 65 have disabilities. We don't see as well, we don't hear as well, we don't move as well, we don't concentrate as well. And also a lot of times older Americans feel that something must be wrong with them. They just must be so stupid they can't figure out how to use this technology, when I don't believe that's true. I believe it is that the designers are not taking the time, for a lot of different reasons, not all on them, but they're not taking the time to really make sure that technology is truly usable for all of us. And that means accessibility, but that also means somebody that is aged into a disability also can use your technology.
So today with Ruh Global Impact, you work with Fortune 100 companies to help shape their efforts around the process and concept of accessibility and inclusion for people with disabilities. When I think of the agility of companies like that, I get this vision of a 1,000-foot cargo ship trying to make a U-turn on a busy street in my neighborhood. And so tell me something that you've learned working with those kind of companies. Tell me something that those companies don't understand when it comes to the work you do.
What they still don't understand, and I do. I have been blessed I have some of the biggest customers that are some of the biggest corporations in the world. What we've evolved into over the last few years, we are talking about it from a much broader lens than just people with disabilities. We're also talking about the intersectionality of diversity and how this is, and once again, this is not just about people with disabilities. This is about people that are aging into disabilities. This is about, the African Americans that might have a disability. So it's all about inclusion. I use often the word inclusion, diversity and disability inclusion. One thing I think that helped me get into these big corporations is that I come from corporations and I know how it works. I know how, even though you're a gigantic brand, $1 trillion brand or $1 billion or hundreds of millions, the reality is you still have a budget, you still have only a limited amount of resources, and you still have other goals that you have to do. So one thing that I still think is happening is that I think most of these gigantic corporations still are not taking this seriously. Now, I think there's a shift happening, but I still think that they're looking at it more as a compliance. It's something they have to do instead of looking at it from the perspective of, first of all, society has expectations of you. Second of all, when you make things accessible and inclusive, it benefits all of your customers and it really benefits you. And so I think I've written about this. I've written 3 books, but my last book is Inclusion Branding. And I talked about this, and I talked about it from more and more societies expecting that you are going to include everybody in the workforce. we're finding that when we hire a diverse workforce, they're actually more creative and innovative. So, and they're actually more productive. And wow, just look at that. We send everybody home teleworking and they're more productive. Wow, just think how much more productive they would be if the systems were accessible to them. I think technology needs to work for humans, and we need to tie technology to humans, and we need to make sure corporations and organizations of all sizes understand that why would you build anything that didn't include all of us? And every time you make things something accessible, it makes it more usable for us to use it. And the more we use it, the more we're going to love your products and the more we're going to support you. So I think we still are there, which is why it's so important that you're in the conversation, Chris, because we need everybody in these conversations, because we're not going to change society if we don't really take the time to reimagine what it could look like.
Debra, it's been an absolute treat to talk with you today. The work you do is so important, and the community you support is so engaged and has come so far, but I know there's still a lot of work to be done. And I would encourage everyone to get involved at either their business or in their community or even at a political level to help keep the ball moving forward. But before I let you go, you mentioned earlier that someone painted a future for your daughter, Sara, that she would at best be pushing carts at a grocery store. Can you tell me what she's doing today?
They told me that Sara would never be able to work in marketable positions, and and they were wrong. The experts were wrong. And she actually did work for 15 years for Nordstrom's, and she worked before that 3 years for Wendy's. So she was in marketable employment. But then Sara got sick, and she got very sick, and she wound up having this rare disorder. It's a blood clot disorder, which I didn't realize it, but it runs in my husband's family. So she got very, very sick. So right now she's much, much, much better. She doesn't speak on stage with me anymore like she used to. I'm hoping she'll start doing that again because she's a wonderful speaker. She's talked on stage to audiences as large as 5,000 people. She's a beautiful little soul, but right now she's not working. But she moved out on her own, air quotes, because she's in a supported apartment, not living with her parents, which she loves, and she lives with another woman that also has disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and then she has a staff that supports them. So they come in and they help them with meals. They help them with grocery shopping. But my daughter is thrilled to be on her own. So she's very happy. And what more do you want for your children than for them to be happy? So she's thriving right now. She's really thriving. And it warms my heart.
Debra's work has taken her around the world to help create programs, develop strategies, and implement processes that fully include persons with disabilities. It's a critical cause that I'd encourage everyone to learn more about. To learn more about Debra and her corporate and advocacy work, please visit ruhglobal.com. That's RUHGLOBAL.com. And listen to her podcast, Human Potential at Work, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find her on Twitter and Facebook at Debra Ruh. You should also check out the Americans with Disabilities website, ada.gov. There you can find news, technical assistance materials, laws and regulations, and much more. You can find transcripts and links from today's show at scrappypod.com. And you can listen back to all the great stories from Season 1 at the website or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, thanks for listening to Scrappy.